Good afternoon. Is the mic on? Yeah. I'm very pleased to welcome you to CITRIS. My name is Camille Crittenden. I'm the Deputy Director of CITRIS and also work with a couple of other programs here in Data and Democracy and the Social Apps Lab. We're really pleased to have you here in person, and I also want to welcome our web viewers. This research exchange series is webcast live every Wednesday at noon to our sister campuses at Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz. So we're pleased to have people viewing remotely as well. Just a couple of quick announcements before I introduce our featured speaker this afternoon. As I mentioned, this research exchange series happens every Wednesday at noon, and if you register, you can enjoy lunch, and if not, come anyway and enjoy the speaker. We have a number of topics and speakers yet to come in the spring semester, including a joint series on resilience that we're hosting together with the Institute for Transportation Studies and Trust, the Center for Cybersecurity. So keep an eye out for that. We'll have 3 speakers in that series, in that joint series, starting next month. So there are details available online about that. We're really pleased to welcome Professor Stephen Wheeler as our speaker this afternoon. Stephen is Associate Professor in the Department of Environmental Design at UC Davis, which he joined in January of 2007. He teaches courses related to community and regional planning, urban design, and sustainable development. His research interests include the theory and practice of sustainable development, the evolution of built landscapes, metropolitan regional planning, and planning strategies to address climate change. So his ideas cross over a number of the research thrust areas of CITRIS, and I know a number of the research interests of all of you in the audience. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Wheeler.
Thank you very much, Camille. CITRIS talks are about the role of technology in society, especially information technology. However, unlike most of the speakers in this series, I have a very mixed relationship with technology and believe that many forms of technology are, in fact, inappropriate for sustainable development. Don't boo yet. I also feel that our society vastly overemphasizes technology at the expense of many other things, such as common sense, critical thinking, behavior change, and attention to low-tech strategies for urban sustainability, and also to make our rather dysfunctional democracy work better. In other words, technology can serve as a distraction from political, social, and personal changes that deserve our attention much more, and that can be dangerous. So rather than running through a list of appropriate technologies for sustainable cities in this talk, I want to ask how we know whether technologies are appropriate or not, and then how we can do a better job of promoting those that we can get behind. This is not an academic question. In the coming years, the state of California and other public and private agencies are likely to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on technologies such as high-speed rail, seawater desalination, large-scale water projects, intelligent highway systems, and self-driving cars, many of which will be promoted as enhancing sustainability. Many of my academic colleagues will likewise spend their time and energy working on these technologies or on technological approaches to contemporary problems. Meanwhile, society is reorienting its entire educational system towards science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the STEM subjects, and gives vastly more funding for research in these fields than in humanities and social sciences. Federal agencies have devoted millions of dollars to studying intelligent vehicles and highway systems, yet until recently, the far more sustainable technologies of walking and biking have gotten very little research money or infrastructure money. Our social priorities are thus highly skewed towards technology. I would argue that we've had most of the technology we need for sustainable communities since the 1970s, if not well before. And what we don't have is a politics and economics or a culture capable of planning for sustainability. So I will come back to that theme again at the end. But in this talk, I'd like to discuss 5 main criteria for determining appropriateness of technology. We'll then look at several examples: high-speed rail, green roofs, and smart controls for use of electricity. And I'll conclude by setting out some possible guidelines for evaluating technologies. I'm going to raise a lot of questions here, and I definitely don't have all the answers, but the starting point is to admit that we as a society don't really know at this point which technologies are most appropriate for sustainability, and to have a dialogue around that. Let me define a couple of terms before going further. By technology, we can talk about a lot of things, including language and particular methods of problem solving. Even democracy could be seen as a technology. Kevin Kelly, a co-founder of Wired magazine, argues that in the broadest sense, technology is a new life form, evolving towards higher and higher levels of information processing, in the process using ourselves as a vehicle to help its own evolution. He calls this sphere the technium. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to take a more limited view and talk mainly about physical devices and procedures that are under our control. At least we hope they're under our control. These machines don't have to be made of metal or silicon. There are many that could be made of plants or other natural materials. There are, for example, living machines to process wastewater and sewage in buildings that incorporate plants, microorganisms, water piping, and other fairly simple technologies such as that. There are also technologies of ecological restoration, for example, recreating streams in cities. Sustainable communities, I will define very simply as just human habitats that are becoming more ecologically and socially healthy. There is no one sustainable end state. Rather, we could move in several directions towards greater health of these systems. And we can figure out if we're making progress through indicators that we decide through democratic process. We can look at greenhouse gas emissions. We can look at species in the city. We can look at ecosystem health, measures of social equality, and surveys of human happiness. Beginning in the 1990s, many local governments began trying to integrate the concept of sustainable communities into their plans. They created standalone sustainability plans, or else, like the city of Berkeley, they brought in sustainability as a theme through all elements of their general plan. However, implementation has been very, very limited to date, and we are at the beginning of this very, very long transition. Nevertheless, sustainability, for better or worse, has become the term of choice for many progressive urban planning goals related to long-term human and ecological welfare. Let me say a bit also about where I'm coming from personally. Many years ago, I had the good fortune to study as an undergraduate with Dana Meadows, the MIT researcher who seems to have been the first person to use the term sustainable development in print in the 1972 book, Limits to Growth. Hopefully a number of you have seen that book. Dana was a pioneer of systems dynamics computer modeling. She was a very technical person, but she also lived in a rural farmhouse and spent much of her life writing a column called The Global Citizen. She felt the key to sustainability lay not in technology, but in changing behavior, worldviews, and values. That perspective has stayed with me ever since. After graduating from college, I worked as an environmental lobbyist in Washington, D.C., trying to stop nuclear power and the nuclear arms race, which seemed like very good examples of out-of-control technology. They still seem that way. My mentor at Friends of the Earth was David Brower, who was a famous environmental leader of the 20th century, who spent much of his life fighting big dams, another inappropriate form of technology, I would argue. Amory Lovins was also on our staff. He developed terms such as soft energy paths and negawatts. Negawatts are what you get when you decide not to build the huge power plant that's going to produce many megawatts of electricity, but instead to adopt fairly small-scale conservation strategies and efficiency strategies which reduce your electric need in the first place, much cheaper and with less pollution. Amory has become probably the world's foremost soft energy or appropriate technology guru, largely through the Rocky Mountain Institute, which he founded with his former wife, Hunter Lovins. So in this context, I started out strongly skeptical of technology. However, I've since made my living at times as a computer programmer. I work a lot with geographic information systems, which is a 3D spatial technology, and I have come to love, just in the last few months, my smartphone. I was trying until last year to be the last person in the world with a flip phone. But then I put it through the wash. And so it seemed like time to catch up with my students and enter the smartphone era. This somewhat schizophrenic relationship with technology that I and many other sustainability advocates have had goes back a long ways. In the late 18th and early 19th century, Ned Ludd and his followers, branded by history as Luddites, fought against new technologies such as power looms that were destroying craft industries in Britain. Ludd supposedly smashed 2 looms in 1779. 19th century literary figures such as Coleridge and Blake also warned against the onslaught of not just new technologies, but the mechanistic thinking that went behind them. Blake famously warned his readers, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." Later, progressive thinkers continued their reactions against industrialization, the growing hegemony of science, and the mechanistic worldview found in much of modernity. Arguably, the 2 most important urban theorists of the 20th century were Lewis Mumford and Jane Jacobs. Neither was a scientist, a social scientist, or an academic of any stripe. They were journalists and humanists who vigorously opposed scientific thought and technology as they were being applied to urban planning. Both called for walkable, human-scale communities, not designed around the motor vehicle, which was the rising technology of the time. Beginning in the, few of the sources in the past, Small is Beautiful, I hope many of you remember, first coined the term appropriate technology. I always like Jerry Mander's book. Jerry Mander has been a San Francisco-based activist against many forms of technology, arguing that this distorts culture's whole direction in ways that I'll talk about later. And then we've had many social movements, particularly beginning in the 1960s, that have fought various forms of technology. Strong opposition arose against nuclear weapons testing, nuclear power, toxic chemicals, pesticides, supersonic airplanes, various forms of electromagnetic radiation, private motor vehicles, waste incinerators, and genetically modified organisms, guns, and advanced military weaponry. These movements proliferate to this day. The newest and broadest movement appears to be against the use of fossil fuels and has led to calls for this university and others to divest themselves of fossil fuel stocks. I predict that this movement will grow and that before long UC will actually have to do this. Given this long history, how do we resolve this complicated relationship between technology and sustainability? Let me suggest 5 key dimensions for analysis. The first is the direct environmental and social impact of each technology. Any new device, of course, uses certain resources, creates pollution, throws some people out of work, hires other people, makes money for some people, and so forth. These impacts can be measured, analyzed, or projected. But we don't often do a very good job of this, and it's usually easy for proponents to cover up these impacts or to take a narrow view of them. We must do better. To take the example on the screen, the photo on the left shows the standard technology used by the Army Corps of Engineers and many other agencies in the 20th century to handle stormwater. They construct a trapezoidal concrete culvert and get it off the landscape as soon as possible. It was very good at that. It wasn't so good at many other things. Nobody talked about impacts on the overall hydrologic system or on water tables that were no longer being recharged by groundwater, by rainfall percolating into the ground, or impacts on local habitats and species, or on human quality of life and aesthetics. Now the appropriate technology for urban stormwater is on the right. It is to leave most of the floodplain intact and to try to minimize hardscape throughout the entire watershed. This has many positive impacts. It slows runoff, it recharges local water tables, maintains habitat and species diversity, and provides places for people to walk, run, or exercise their dogs. Also, places for kids to play. So this more holistic look at the impacts of any technology is our starting point. We need much more practice at seeing impacts holistically. A second dimension in which to evaluate the appropriateness of any technology is context. Does the technology fit the context in which it is being proposed? Is it flexible and adaptable if the context changes? We really need to think about these days with climate change. For example, desalinizing ocean water to provide drinking water may make sense in a few isolated contexts, in particular island communities with very little freshwater availability, and perhaps desert towns where abundant sunshine or wind power can produce the electricity for desalinization. But in California, it makes very little sense. This technology is very expensive and uses fantastic amounts of energy. Much better solutions are available in the form of water conservation and reuse of wastewater. The San Diego region is about to find this out. San Diego County has invested in a $1 billion desalinization plant in Carlsbad on the coast that will open in 2016. And by doing so, it has saddled its ratepayers with very high water bills for decades. The city of San Diego, which is a separate jurisdiction within the county, is building facilities to treat its sewage to drinking water standards and recycle that water into reservoirs. That approach provides twice as much water for 20% less cost and with far less environmental impact. So that latter set of strategies seems much more appropriate to the California context. This photo shows rooftop solar hot water in Turkey, actually. This is a very, very widely used technology in the Middle East and actually in parts of China as well. It's cheap, small scale, and context appropriate if you have lots of sunshine. We don't use it much in California, and I'm not sure why. It may be that our culture is affluent, fossil fuel energy is cheap, and there's little incentive. It may be also that photovoltaics and the electronic technology is just more sexy. So we want to put photovoltaics on our roof instead of solar hot water. But maybe these things can be overcome, either the economics or the attitudes. The third dimension I want to talk about is scale, control, and power. For any given technology, what is its natural scale? Who controls it, and which elements in society are going to benefit from it? These things tend to go together. Large-scale technology usually has to be centrally controlled by experts and tends to empower large agencies or corporations. These big institutions, in turn, are run by elites. Nuclear power is the classic example of an extremely large-scale technology controlled entirely by experts. In contrast, small-scale technology is more accessible to ordinary people, lends itself to decentralized use, evades centralized control, and may empower a broad variety of stakeholders. These things are generally pluses for sustainability. Rooftop solar is a classic example, or the bicycle. Small-scale technology are often more flexible, and each increment is relatively cheap. However, because these technologies are decentralized and hard to control, large institutions usually aren't very interested in them. If we had had a General Motors promoting bicycles in the 20th century, we'd have a lot more of them. So we have a lot of work to do to counter imbalances produced by power and large scale. But the scale issue of any technology isn't simple. Big isn't always bad, and small isn't necessarily decentralized and local. Centralized solar and wind farms may make sense in some places, though decentralized renewable energy has many potential advantages over them. My cell phone is small scale, but it is produced by Apple, a very big company, and uses software created by other big companies. Many people thought the internet would be a very decentralizing technology and potentially empower small groups, individuals, alternative forces in society. However, we've seen that's changed over time, or maybe it was always not as small as we thought. And now the internet is dominated by Google, Facebook, Twitter, other big corporations. As feminist critic Astra Taylor points out, also the vast majority of internet executives, content creators, and bloggers are now also white men. Yes, the internet made possible new forms of activism, such as MoveOn.org and Change.org. but it has also made possible instantaneous business and financial transactions worldwide that arguably have further centralized wealth and political power and increased inequality. So technologies that seem to start out small-scale and decentralized can wind up quite differently unless society takes steps to counter powerful interests who may co-opt them. The fourth dimension I want to talk about is socialization and behavior change. This is going to be one of the big needs of the next century. How do we use technologies to change our behavior in sustainable directions? To what extent does a particular technology socialize those using it to see the world in certain ways and live according to certain values? Motor vehicles, for example, revolutionized urban development, leading to vastly different landscapes and lifestyles than would have occurred otherwise. However, I'd be willing to argue that cities and towns would be far more sustainable if autos had never been invented, or at least if societies hadn't catered to them almost exclusively in the last century. Television, video games, and other electronic media have also helped socialize individuals towards a global culture of overconsumption, hypermobility, and uniformity. These values and behaviors are things we must talk about if we want to move towards sustainability. Some people will argue that technologies are value neutral. It all depends on how they are used. But each technology lends itself to particular types of use and certain types of control and power. The challenge for society is to get out in front of each technology and make sure it is appropriately limited and regulated. This is not easy, I know. A final dimension, and on the slide we see Fox News, which is a technology for a certain type of political power, and on the right we see a small-scale feedback type technology. Anybody who's had a hybrid knows that many of us as drivers get trained to drive more fuel efficiently by getting the real-time feedback and seeing those bars go up. Last dimension I want to talk about, monopolization of attention. Do societies and people become fixated on a particular technology as the answer to particular needs and fail to see other more appropriate strategies? We have seen this problem, or is the technology an excuse for not taking other forms of action? We have seen this problem quite a bit with climate change, in which fossil fuel corporations have trotted out natural gas and clean coal as technological solutions to the problem, when neither is in fact clean and both distract from the need to use less energy and switch to renewable sources. So let's look now at how these 5 dimensions of analysis can be applied to some technologies in California. And I'm going to start with high-speed rail, which is one of the most controversial and expensive things the state is going to do, if in fact it does it. Jerry Brown has staked much of his legacy on this project. And many environmentalists, many of my friends, support it. But it's pretty questionable whether high-speed rail is in fact an appropriate strategy. The list of sustainability pros and cons might look something like this. I am not going to go through all of these. Each one of these, we could ask what the data is, we could investigate at some length, which is why I put question marks after all of them. And in many of these cases, data has been manipulated by the proponents of the project. For example, ridership estimates have been all over the board and are pretty questionable. So what are the direct impacts? There's a certain set of direct impacts, which would be lots of farmland, habitat, energy use, embodied greenhouse gas emissions, and construction of the system. And there will be some impacts such as noise pollution that, to my knowledge, nobody has yet raised at all. Anybody who's been near the TGV in France knows that when you run trains at 180 miles an hour, they're noisy. This is the TGV at the bottom. And that's going to be an issue in many areas. Impacts are traditionally researched within environmental impact reports. But in this case, the system EIR seems to have been done by the High-Speed Rail Authority itself and looks relatively biased in terms of its assumptions and the alternatives studied. The agency is also breaking more detailed impact analysis out into different EIRs for each segment. And most of the technical stuff is going to be in those separate EIRs. This is a classic institutional strategy to avoid analyzing cumulative impacts. So having a neutral party study the impacts of such projects would be a good starting place if we want to really get a better handle on them. The context for high-speed rail in California is also pretty questionable. We are not Europe, Japan, or China. We're a low-density, spread-out society, except for San Francisco, and probably won't have very much ridership for this train. Our state's context also includes a long history of weak land use planning. And so it's pretty unlikely that we're going to get a lot of new transit development anytime soon to provide ridership. The history also has major cutbacks to local public transit in recent decades, which have had major social justice impacts on lower income communities of color and many others. Both of these factors contextual factors undercut the case for spending so much money on this technology. High-speed rail is, of course, a very large-scale technology, very centralized, that will be built and operated by big organizations and will generate a lot of money for them. Already, corporations from China, Germany, and France are jockeying to get contracts and have funded symposia here at UC Berkeley to promote the benefits of high-speed rail. Siemens currently has a life-size model of a high-speed train on the Capitol grounds in Sacramento, presumably to woo lawmakers and to show them what a wonderful technology this is. So power dynamics are at play, and the winners are likely to be very large global entities. Advocates of high-speed rail probably expect it to have a large effect on behavior and lifestyle, our socialization dimension, getting people out of cars and planes. Ridership estimates are very unreliable at this point, but I'm guessing that's not going to happen. Yes, some people will use the train to commute regularly from San Francisco to LA or vice versa, instead of flying. But these will be mainly upscale professionals. And in a sustainable society, I don't think we should be encouraging that sort of commuting by any mode. Most Californians won't ride the train or will do so only occasionally, especially since you'll need a car once you get off at almost all stations. And their daily behavior won't be affected. For some people, high-speed rail will be an important symbol of California's commitment to environmental responsibility, whether or not it actually reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm betting it won't. That symbolic value may, in fact, be worth spending $100 billion on. But I think there are better ways to burnish the state's environmental reputation. Last but not least, high-speed rail may monopolize public attention and funding for a very long time. That's a problem if it distracts from more important sustainable city strategies. If we could spend the same $100 billion on local bike, pedestrian, and transit improvements throughout the state, we'd probably reduce greenhouse gases by a far larger amount and serve a far larger and more diverse population without the need for a large ongoing subsidy. So in all these dimensions, high-speed rail looks like a somewhat questionable technology for sustainable development in California. I'm not going to say it's bad per se, because all of these things could be investigated further, but based on these dimensions of analysis, it looks pretty iffy. Let's look at another technology, which is a very different one, green roofs. As many of you know, these consist of layers of different waterproof membranes, drainage materials, growing media, and plants on the top of buildings. And they do have many benefits in terms of saving energy, keeping water on site, providing habitat, and cooling the city. Again, we could get data on each one of these, but they have been built many places, and they do seem to have these virtues. The direct impacts of installing green roofs are pretty small. Any given roof isn't going to do that much, either pro or con. On the other hand, that's a virtue. If this technology turns out not to work well in our climate, we can just stop building them. You don't need to invest $100 billion before you have an operational system. At a few tens of thousands of dollars per building, we can experiment. We can try different soil and planting mixes. We can measure runoff and energy savings as we go. And then we can refine the technology. Also, unlike larger scale projects, this very small scale technology isn't going to concentrate employment benefits in just a few places or dump billions of dollars into the coffers of just a few corporations. Rather, it's likely to employ people making middle-class wages within many existing California cities and towns. and there are lots of urban sustainability benefits to all this stuff. Are green roofs going to socialize people in any particular direction? Probably not, although they do seem to have a lot of symbolic value for individuals who view them as symbolizing a different direction for cities. We are in the process of greening cities in many different ways through small community gardens and parklets and many other things. All this cumulatively does add up, and it helps draw people back to cities and enjoy a higher quality of life within what was seen during the 20th century as generally a noisy, unpleasant place to be. So these things may be benefits. Are green roofs going to monopolize attention and resources? Again, probably not. There's very little risk of that as well. Are they appropriate to the California context? Here we have some bigger issues. California's summer dry Mediterranean climate makes it very difficult to maintain green roofs here when compared with cool, wet places like the Pacific Northwest or even hot, wet places like Florida. We're either going to have to irrigate them in the summer or we're going to have to get creative. We could, for example, shade our green roofs with semi-opaque solar panels or other forms of shade structures. Or we could use desert plants or grasses that go dormant in the summer. There are other contextual problems as well, such as the fact that it's often difficult to retrofit existing roofs and to work with pitched roofs. Such issues will need to be worked out. But based on the 5 dimensions being explored here, it seems that green roofs are quite possibly an appropriate technology for sustainable cities. Let's look at a third and final technology, smart controls for electric energy systems. And this is something that CITRIS is working a great deal with. Smart controls keep track of energy flows within buildings, cars, or industrial systems, and ideally help users gain maximum efficiency. They may display information to consumers in user-friendly ways and also feed information back to building managers or utilities. These aren't a low-tech organic technology like green roofs. Instead, they rely on 21st century electronics and software. But they also aren't big and centralized like high-speed rail. Their sustainability pros and cons might look something like this, and again, I'm not going to go through these. Negative direct impacts seem relatively small, although some people do worry about electromagnetic radiation from smart meters. This technology also seems highly flexible and able to fit many contexts. In many respects, it's located on the small-scale, decentralized end of the continuum, and in theory doesn't need to be managed by distant experts. However, devices such as smart meters are installed and controlled by large utilities, such as PG&E, and may centralize information about users' habits, which could be a privacy problem. A skilled hacker might be able to access your real-time utility information, learn when you're on vacation, and rob your home. Or maybe utilities will figure out nefarious ways to shame over consumers, bringing up right-wing fears of an efficiency police. On the positive side, smart controls may play a large role in socializing energy users into more energy-efficient lifestyles through real-time feedback and various forms of reinforcement for behavior change. That could be extremely useful for sustainable cities. However, there's a problem in that, in my experience, building users usually know very little about these controls, and building managers often don't want building users to touch them. So we have a gap between the technology, in many cases, and the user's ability to work with it, and we need to bridge that gap. Finally, unlike high-speed rail, smart controls don't seem like the sort of large-scale technology that is likely to monopolize society's attention and resources. On the other hand, they may still channel attention towards a technological fix for building energy efficiency, rather than behavioral changes on the part of occupants or new design strategies on the part of the architect and construction team. And that could be a negative. Also, tweaking the electric distribution system through technology, such as this, may distract attention from the need to question why private utilities are controlling that system in the first place, and whether better institutional arrangements are necessary. By now, my proposed guidelines for appropriate technology for sustainable communities should be pretty clear. New technologies should have minimal direct and indirect impacts on social environmental systems and a low level of risk. They should fit with each context in which they're used. They should have an appropriate level of scale and control, which often means small scale, accessible, and decentralized. However, if by its nature some desirable technology has to be large scale, then we need to ensure that it is flexible, adaptable, and under strong social control so that powerful interests don't use it for their own ends. New technologies should also have appropriate social and behavioral effects, which means that they should promote rather than undermine sustainable behaviors. And lastly, new technologies shouldn't distract attention or resources from other more appropriate strategies, including the need for institutional, political, and behavioral reform. Let me add a few words of caution as a conclusion. Be wary, the playing field is not even. Powerful interests promote some technologies rather than others. There is a techno-industrial complex that often promotes inappropriate strategies. Always be aware of the constellation of power surrounding any technology and the dynamics that may lead to. Also, the techno-industrial complex promotes technology in general as a solution to all problems. Humans seem to have a natural tendency towards technological optimism. That point of view championed several decades ago by Julian Simon in contrast to the limits to growth viewpoint. For example, it's much easier to think that a technical device will remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere than to look at the really tough questions of how to improve democratic decision-making, defuse the power of the fossil fuel lobby, and adopt less carbon-intensive lifestyles. I would argue that among the forces directing human social evolution, technology and economics have gotten out of hand at the expense of many other more important factors. Let me just show a couple quick diagrams. I'm very interested in the concept of social ecology. That is, how do societies evolve so as to be able to be more sustainable? You can diagram these various factors very simply like this. I would argue that we are at a point where economics and technology are far the most dominant influences, and we have lost the ability to really think about what are the values of the culture, what's the mindset the cognition that we are working with, how do we nurture leadership, and how do we reform our institutions, such as democracy in this country. So this is a problem, and addressing this is going to be one of our biggest challenges in this century. In the long run, the soft technologies of democracy, education, and behavior change are probably far more important to sustainable development than any new device we could dream up. So by all means, let's have technology, but within each new innovation, let's ask if it is appropriate to the sustainable communities of the future. When in doubt, it is wise to go slowly and invoke one of the basic tropes of the sustainability discourse, the precautionary principle, which states that if an action might have harmful effects, the burden of proof is on the advocates of the action, and caution is the appropriate strategy. Perhaps the technology should wait until society can more effectively control it. Or perhaps it isn't needed at all. Though the momentum behind each new technical advance is great, we need to be brave enough to ask such questions, to hold back, or to reorient our work in better directions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wheeler. We have time for a few questions.
I've been to a lot of lectures in this room over the past year or two, and the high-tech ones, it's packed. Today, it's not. Do you have any proposal for how to offset this prejudice? How to make people more aware of the issues you're discussing and the context?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer. This reinforces the theory that there is this technium that has its own momentum and attracts people. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, appropriate technology has been around since the 70s, if not before. If you find the answer, let me know. But I think, actually, let me be more hopeful. I'm sorry, let me be more hopeful. I think there is a generational change going on, and that social change is generational and has to be in many ways. The millennials are moving back to cities. They are driving less. They are interested in urban gardening and urban farming and other sorts of small-scale, appropriate, what I would call relatively appropriate stuff. So I think there is something of a reaction going on demographically, and we have to hope that that will build.
I also think there's good reason for optimism. Actually, my question is regarding rebound effects, because even as a consumer and someone who wants to do well by the planet, I'm not really sure what's best. Like if I am more economical with energy and so forth, I've heard from some analyses the best thing I can do for the planet is to take the money and bury it in my backyard, because otherwise it might go back in the economy. Other greenhouse gases will be spawned by virtue of that. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that, or if that is part of a modulator among technologies that we might consider, like how will this keep people from driving their Prius more just because they got a Prius or something like that?
I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert in this question, but from what I've read, the rebound effect is only partial, and that you do still get benefit. So I think that benefit is worth doing whatever the initiative is. And for burying your money in the backyard, well, I can tell you some other places to send it instead. Yeah.
Hi, my question is about the high-speed trains. As a French citizen, I'm a huge fan of high-speed trains. And I was wondering if you think that there's maybe a more appropriate place in the States where one would be a better idea. For example, maybe between Boston and New York. I've lived on the East Coast, and the train that's connecting those two cities right now is painfully slow.
Yeah, the Eastern Corridor is definitely the place to do it if you're going to do it in the U.S. But with transportation, the real need, in my view, is to travel less and to live more locally and to redesign cities so that you don't have to drive everywhere and you can combine trips and lots of other things. And so that people live near their jobs and all this other good stuff. That's a mindset change that the proponents of high-speed rail are working against. They're still in the unlimited mobility camp. I've ridden the TGV, I've ridden lots of others. I personally don't need to move that fast, among other things. I mean, it is fun, but I like the old trains where you actually sit facing people and you get to know them and you can open the windows and you can smell the countryside. I know that I'm in a minority, but just sitting in banked seats like an airplane on a train going 180 miles an hour, I don't need to do that.
What about business people who commute, either live in Boston, work in New York, the other way around?
That's a lifestyle problem. We need to address that lifestyle problem head on. Do we want to encourage long-distance commuting? There are lots of people who commute from San Francisco to LA. That's not a sustainable lifestyle any way you cut it, no matter what the technology is. So let's discourage that. Let's use Skype. Maybe other technologies will come in. There's lots of ways to collaborate. We used to use phones and faxes, and I just don't think people need to commute daily or even 3 or 4 times a week or whatever, that distance. That's not a sustainable lifestyle, period.
So first of all, I want to commend you on your honesty and your a lot of really good ideas, and these are things that I thought of. I think the other place that made money for Amtrak was from Sacramento to San Jose, and that's probably where I would have wanted to see the high-speed rail if they're going to do it, because you want to have win factors, so people say, oh, this is a positive thing. My biggest fear is if this fails, people are going to be so discouraged to ever do something like this again for a long time. As to address your thing with solar hot water, I'm a big proponent of solar hot water. California was the birthplace of solar hot water, first with the climax system and then the day and night system. A large part of our cities had solar hot water because it was cheaper than coal. Coal was $18. And the thing is, we have to make it attractive. And the thing that actually helped kill solar hot water in California was public policy when people meant to do well. And I have a lot of respect for Jimmy Carter. But when he gave too much money for rebates, all the charlatans got in. There were crummy jobs. The people who actually were doing that high-quality work, proponing it, now lost their jobs because of the flood of the market. And I think if Steve Jobs was going to create a solar cell, it would look like a roof, but it would just function like getting the hot water. And the other thing, too, that's probably going to get rid of the traditional solar cells, because my friends have been doing this for like 30 or 40 years, is it's now so efficient to collect electricity and now on demand that they're just going to use that storage to heat the water instead of running it through all the things that are more complicated and way more on the roof and things like that. But it's going to be a solar, but it's going to be done indirectly instead of just heating the water itself. And I thought that was great.
I think my own house may have been a victim of one of those shoddy solar hot water installers, because we still have the stuff that it broke and got pulled off. Let me go back to, if I can, just to a previous question a little bit. I am also kind of disturbed that we don't have more audience here today. I wasn't going to do this talk in the beginning because I looked at the lecture series, I thought this is too technologically oriented. They're just going to be a bunch of, people who like technology. And then I got talked into it by Yvette. But this is a problem. And I don't know, I'm going to throw this back to CITRIS and ask how can we reframe technology in a way that does focus on the small-scale appropriate sides of it and get people excited about those. Yeah.
So we have one question. We're going to come here and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. First, I want to say thank you for clarifying the word Luddite, which is usually used as anti-technologist, but started out as a labor movement and was grounded in society. So I appreciate that. My second question is, a lot of these sort of decentralized or locally controlled technologies, like the smart meter is a great example, did evolve out, as you admitted, came out of sort of high technology, advanced technology programs. And a lot of the argument is that, technology development is agnostic, sort of fate agnostic. You could end up with cheap electricity or a hydrogen bomb. Any comments on how to navigate sort of developing new technologies with the goal of long-term sustainability and not letting those kind of go awry in a way that doesn't benefit society?
That's a tough question. I don't know the answer. And how do we develop technologies while keeping social control, while keeping the lid on them? Obviously, we're not doing very well as a society. This is where reforming democracy has to come in. This is where some pretty basic social changes. And that's too much for me to go into right now. As far as smart controls, I think smart controls are great. Do I think they're necessary? No. I think the most important thing is smart users. People who, just to give a personal example, my wife and I do have a smart controller of our heating and air conditioning. We don't use it. We don't set it. We simply, when we need a little more warmth, we turn up the thermostat and we turn it down. We don't have it go on at 9 o'clock every night and off at 5 or whatever. And we, I think, use less that way than we would if we'd had a programmed schedule that went on when we weren't there or we didn't need it. So smart users, I think that's the most important thing. Who cares about technology? Huh? No, I didn't say that. This is CITRIS. I didn't say that.
So, yeah, so I just want to thank CITRIS for having you come and give this talk, because I think that this thrust of within CITRIS's bigger portfolio deserves some more attention, and I hope we'll have similar talks in the future. And I wanted to ask you if you can recommend for students today a couple of authors or think tanks, contemporary authors and think tanks, that we should be reading in order to learn more about this point of view.
Okay, I can't give you a good answer off the top of my head. There are some good organizations. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance has been around for a long time. A lot of environmental organizations do focus on technology in one way or another. Mark, help me out on this. You've got anybody?
Well,
Rocky Mountain Institute, of course, has lots of great stuff. They should just dig around. They will find it.
People can also email you, and you might think of some more stuff in the next day.
Anybody in the audience have any suggestions? Yeah.
I can't. This is embarrassing. It has exactly the BECC, Behavior for Energy and Climate Change. It's a regular conference of practitioners and not very many academics. There's a lot of anthropologists. Any papers coming out of BECC, all they talk about is behavior and behavioral change,
Yeah.
and norm change, and value change. They don't talk about
And one of our CITRIS associate directors is going to be the conference chair this year, coming up in the fall. So it's
Okay.
very much affiliated with the California Institute for Energy and the Environment, that conference. Therese.
Also, the organization Cool California, which may now be called Cool Climate, I'm not sure, has great metric calculators and other types of information online.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up the formal program for now, but if Professor Wheeler has time, he's certainly welcome to stay and have more informal conversation. We really appreciate your
Thank you all for
perspective.
coming.